everyone, my name is Margaret Burgess and I'm with Atlanta Legal Aid in the Decatur office. I am actually serving with a project that works not only in Decatur and DeKalb County, but also the other 4 counties that Atlanta Legal Aid serves. So that includes DeKalb, Gwinnett, Fulton, Clayton, and Cobb County. So I'll describe a little bit about the work that I'm focusing on in our Decatur office that touches those other counties as well. So at Legal Aid, I am focusing in particular on fair housing enforcement. So there's a lot of folks are familiar with the Federal Fair Housing Act, and Georgia has like a lot of other states, has its own state version of the Fair Housing Act that pretty much mirrors the federal one. A lot of folks have heard about this law before, that it says essentially you can't discriminate in housing against somebody based on their race or their gender or something like that. What gets a little more complicated, though, is what fair housing violations look like in practice, and that people don't always recognize when the Fair Housing Act is being violated. So in particular, my project at Legal Aid focuses on 2 key parts of the Fair Housing Act that are at issue. One is disability discrimination. And I'll step back for a moment and say, some of my colleagues in the Decatur office are working on issues with homeowners, and I'm working on issues that are particular to people who are renting. So everything I'm talking about is for folks who are renting apartments, renting homes. So with disability discrimination, a lot of our clients at Legal Aid have some sort of disability or have a family member with a disability. And either they're applying to get into housing, housing that they need to be accessible maybe in some way, or maybe they're currently in an apartment or a house, and they might need modifications based on their disability, or they might just need some accommodations in kind of the processes of how they interact with the landlord, how they interact with property management. There's all kinds of protections, not just in the Fair Housing Act, the words themselves, but HUD has provided a lot of guidance that's really helpful in this context. A really common problem that we're seeing with disability discrimination is a failure of landlords to kind of understand and do their duty under the reasonable accommodation provision. So reasonable accommodation, essentially, the Fair Housing Act says that if a person with a disability has to have an equal opportunity to enjoy their housing, to be in their house, just like someone who doesn't have a disability. And so sometimes that requires a landlord to make what's called a reasonable accommodation. One that we see a good bit and that I just dealt with the other day is someone requesting to have an emotional support animal or an assistance animal. There's different terms for this, service animal even. And sometimes up front in the application, a landlord or an apartment complex might say, well, no pets allowed, including that one. And even though the person might come in saying, but I need an accommodation, this is an animal that is a support animal, it's here to help me with my disability. Sometimes landlords still say no, sometimes they say yes, and then they'll charge an extra fee or some kind of large deposit, or put other kind of like very onerous restrictions on the person with the animal. And these are the kinds of things that are supposed to be accommodated for a person with a disability. This whole reasonable accommodation part of the law is supposed to be allowing for flexibility and negotiation to help people with disabilities live in their housing more easily and stay in their housing more easily. So that comes up in the emotional support animal and the assistance animal context. It also comes up in a lot of different ways that people may not always realize, sometimes even in the eviction context. So a lot of the housing related cases that we get at Legal Aid, not only in DeKalb County, but the other offices, are folks who are being evicted. And sometimes what happens is someone with a disability is being evicted for something that may have to do with their disability. So for instance, we've seen cases before where someone might be getting Social Security payments a certain time of the month. So SSI payments typically come in around the 5th of the month, the 5th of every month. And so if you are on a fixed income, which a lot of our clients are, they have to make those payments right on the 5th or right after. They can't be making rent payments by the 1st of the month because they don't have the money. And some landlords have been inflexible in their requirements under the lease, saying you have to pay by the 1st or the 3rd of the month, even though these folks with disabilities don't have the money coming in. And there's good cases saying that they can't do that. They have to reasonably, as long as the person makes an accommodation request saying, "Dear landlord, I need this accommodation because I get my payments based on my disability at the 5th of every month. Can I please pay by the 6th instead?" And if the landlord refuses to engage in that process and to grant that kind of reasonable accommodation, that's a problem. And that's where we can be helpful. And it's essentially kind of, again, adding flexibility to policies and rules that may end up just harming people with disabilities more than others. I had a client a few months ago who is in a wheelchair, and she lived in an apartment complex where she was unable to essentially use her toilet because the grab bar that was installed in the wrong place, and she needed a grab bar to be installed in a different place, actually 2 grab bars to be installed in different places so that she could actually use her toilet. And sometimes she'd be falling and she'd have to call EMS to help her. It was a really bad situation. She also had a stove in her kitchen that wasn't accessible for someone in a wheelchair. All the dials on the stove were on the very back, and she couldn't reach them. So there are handicap accessible stoves that have the dials on the front. And so essentially, she had been requesting these kinds of modifications from the landlord for a long time. Months go by, no response. And we got involved and found out that this particular complex has received a federal subsidy. And with that federal subsidy comes certain obligations. So I'll say at this point, a private landlord who doesn't receive any federal subsidy, they are required under the Fair Housing Act to allow you to make a reasonable modification, such as, if you're in a wheelchair and you need that grab bar, they can't keep you from doing that, but you would have to pay for it. Except in the situation where some properties get federal subsidies, and we can help people figure out if they're in one of those properties or not. And then in that instance, because she was in that property, they had to pay for it, and they did. We at Legal Aid want to be responsive to the needs that are actually in the community. And so a lot of what I've talked about today is important to me, and I hope also important to the community, because I feel like fair housing enforcement can sometimes feel pretty removed from what people are actually suffering from. People can maybe attend trainings or lectures on the Fair Housing Act, and it kind of sounds pie in the sky, like, oh, you can't discriminate against someone because of their race. Well, what does that really look like in today's world for renters? And so that's where Legal Aid is trying to be responsive, whether in our home defense program or in our housing rental programs that we work with people on. We're trying to be responsive to the needs that are coming up. And I'll say generally, but beyond just housing issues, Legal Aid deals with all kinds of problems and helps people with all kinds of problems. In our general law unit, we help with domestic issues, so things along child support, divorce, domestic violence, and helping people with sometimes employment issues or consumer issues that might come up. A lot of the work we do is housing, but it's not the only thing. So people should keep us in mind when they are dealing with those other issues as well.